Hey there, wire weavers. Today we're going to talk about balling the ends of wire with a torch. Now I know a lot of you are nervous about using a torch, and I get it. It's scary playing with fire. But you're going to find that a torch is actually a really simple device to use. It's just a tool like any other tool, and we're going to take some safety precautions, use common sense. Once you get over the initial nervousness about using a torch, you're going to find that it's just so much fun to do. My name is Wendy, and I'm the wire weaver behind Door 44 Studios. Welcome to my channel. Now, as most of you know, I'm an apartment dweller, so I've come up with an easy way to set up my hot bench. I use small items that store easily, and yet I can still do these functions in my small workspace. So if you live in an apartment, you live in a small house, you can do this at your kitchen table, you can do it over your kitchen stove, you can do it at your desk. Just make sure that you clear away any flammables. You want to get rid of any paperwork, that sort of thing that's on your work surface. Give yourself a couple of feet of clear open space to work in. Now you just need a few simple tools. First, of course, you're going to need a torch. This is a Bernzomatic butane torch. I bought mine on Amazon, and I'll go ahead and provide a link below if you'd like to use the same torch that I use. But any butane torch will work for this purpose. You can find them at your local hardware store, so if you want to shop locally, look there first. And of course, you can always find them online. The next thing you're going to need is a pair of cross-lock tweezers with insulated handles. These stay nice and cool while you're working with a flame. And I do recommend that you use cross-lock tweezers. And that's because they lock in the neutral position, and they're going to keep a nice firm grip on your wire. You don't want to use pliers or anything that you have to actively grip, because you run the risk of dropping a hot wire onto your surface. You can burn yourself, you can burn your workbench. So go ahead and invest in these. They're not very expensive. And again, I'll provide a link below in the description. This is one tool that I strongly recommend that everybody use. I don't recommend using pliers. You're also going to need some type of bowl for quenching your hot wire. So we're just going to put water in this. Nothing fancy, no chemicals, just plain tap water. But you do want something that's dedicated to this, because you don't want to mix anything that you use for making jewelry with making food. Just common sense. You're also going to need some sort of heat-proof surface. Now, I just use this small 8-inch square baking pan. You just want something with a lip that's going to catch any drips of hot metal or, little specks of fire scale that will flake off. Anything hot you want to capture in this heat-proof surface. So things that work really well are cookie sheets, baking pans. You can use a large ceramic tile, something like 18 inches square will also work, but I prefer something with a lip that will capture any drips and just contain those in a nice fireproof, safe environment. The last thing you're going to need, if you can see over my shoulder there's a small slow cooker on my bench, and I use that for my pickle. Now, pickle is something that you're absolutely going to need to use. It's basically a warm acidic bath that you drop your torched wire in, and this is going to remove fire scale. Now, almost any metal that you use is going to create fire scale. So if you use copper, sterling silver, brass, bronze, any of those wires, they're all going to develop a fire scale. And that has to be removed with a warm acid bath. There are commercial pickles available on the market. I don't use that. I just use a homemade recipe that just consists of 2 ingredients, white vinegar and salt, and I'll provide that recipe in the description below. So those are all the tools that you're going to need to get started. If you have any questions, just drop them in the comments below and I'll answer those as I see them. Before we get started, I just want to talk about how I've set up my bench for doing hot work. Notice that I have cleared away anything that's flammable from my work surface so that I can do this process without a lot of clutter around me, without anything, having to worry about paper or anything like that that's going to catch fire quickly if a piece of molten metal happens to drop on it. So you just want to have a very clear, clean work surface. And notice that I'm left-handed, right? So I have my everything set up. I have my wire that I'm going to use, my wire cutters, my cross-lock tweezers all on my left, as well as my quenching bowl. So this allows me to prep my wire, and then I turn on the flame of my torch, and I can use my cross-lock tweezers to hold that wire in the flame, and I can go straight to my quenching bowl without ever having to cross the flame, without, just, you want to set your bench up in a way that works safely, efficiently, and ergonomically for you. So if you're right-handed, you're going to flip this around, you're going to put your quenching bowl on the right, so you can move your right hand from your flame to your quenching bowl quickly and easily. This is really important, especially in a small space, especially, if you're working on a kitchen table or something like that. Come up with a setup that works for you every time and use that same setup whenever you use your torch. Now this is my crock pot that I use for my pickle. And again, this is something you want to dedicate to this function. So this little crock pot here, it sits here all the time. It contains my pickle. And the reason why I use a dedicated pot for this is because pickle does become toxic eventually. Now initially you start out with vinegar and salt, so non-toxic. But as you use the pickle, notice how blue that solution is? That is filled with copper sulfate salts at this point, and those are toxic. So you want to be smart about this. Keep that contained. Keep it away from pets. Keep it away from children. Now, you're going to find that this will build up over time. This pickle is pretty well used. See those sulfate buildup there? So this you're going to have to dispose of at your local toxic waste facility. Don't dump this down the drain. Don't dump it in your yard. You do want to just let the fluid evaporate. And then I'd put those copper salts in a disposable container and take them to my local toxic waste dump. So now let's talk about the anatomy of a torch. Now every torch is going to be a little bit different, but most torches will come with some instructions here that will kind of give you an idea of where everything is and how to use it. So you have an air switch up here, which allows you to adjust airflow. There's a flame modulator here that allows you to adjust your flame. And there's not a lot of adjustment on these torches, but you don't, frankly, need to use a lot of adjustment. This is a child-proof safety latch. You're just going to pull this down to activate the trigger. This is your trigger. And notice that while that child safety latch is in place, I cannot activate the trigger. So this can't be ignited accidentally by a child. And then this switch here is for creating a continuous flame. So you can lock that trigger into place, or if you don't use the continuous flame lock, once you release the trigger, the flame is going to extinguish. Again, these are really simple devices. Every one is a little bit different. Read the instructions that come with your torch and get familiar with it. This is a tool that you need to be very comfortable using. So make sure that you know where everything is, you know how everything works before you start trying to use your torch for working with wire. So to ignite my torch, I'm just going to slide that child safety latch down and firmly press the igniter. Now this doesn't always light on the first try, so sometimes you have to do it a couple of times, but there we go. Now if I release that trigger, flame goes out. So I can ignite it again and then press my continuous flame lock, and now you can see that that flame is working continuously. Now to release that, you just press the trigger again. So once again, release the safety, ignite the flame, lock the flame into place. To stop the flame, press the trigger. See how that works? And we talked about how to use your torch. A very important thing to know also is how to fuel your torch. This is butane fuel, and I purchased mine at my local Lowe's store. You can get this, you know, at most hardware stores. They're going to have it in the tools section. These bottles come with this little tube style valve, and if you look at the bottom of your torch, you're going to see another small valve at the bottom of your torch, and this is where you add your fuel. So to do this, and I already filled my torch is fully fueled, so I'm not gonna demonstrate this live, but you just take this bottle and press it over that valve and push down firmly. And as you do that, the fuel is going to be injected into the reservoir of your torch. And the indication that your torch is full is you'll start to see fuel kind of sputter out around this valve. So that's when you stop and you just remove the bottle. And then you want to let this sit for about 3 minutes. And you can see my torch has pretty clear instructions here on how to fuel this up, and it also says to wait 3 minutes before use. And that's just to allow any excess fuel to evaporate before you ignite a flame, so that you don't create a flash situation where, you know, if you still have a lot of butane fumes in the air around your torch and you ignite that flame, you're gonna get a fuel flash. So you just want to avoid that, so give it time to evaporate. I typically fuel up my torch outside, so I'll just step out onto our balcony and do it there. So I have lots of ventilation and there's no chance of, you know, having any sort of flash type situation because I don't fuel my torch at my bench. So keep that in mind. Use common sense, be safe, use safe practices, and you won't have any problems with the torch. So we've talked about the anatomy of the torch, we've talked about how to fuel it, how to use it. Now let's talk about the anatomy of your flame. This is also very important to know. So I'm going to go ahead and ignite my torch, and notice that your flame has two very distinct parts to it. So there's this outer flame that's a very light pale blue, and then you have this inner flame which is a bright blue cone shape, and it's very distinctly shaped. That cone is actually the cooler part of your flame, and the hottest part of this flame is just in front of the tip of that inner cone. So that's where you're going to want to concentrate the tip of your wire when we're working to ball up the ends of the wire. Now we're also going to use this cooler part of the flame to fire polish the balls of your wire, and that's just going to give you a nice smooth clean finish. So we'll talk about that as well. So we're going to go ahead and get started balling some wire here, and I'm using 18 gauge wire for this demonstration. I cut a piece about 5.5 inches long. This is what I specify for the twig pendant, and of course we are gearing up for the twig pendant make along here, and that's why we're doing this tutorial today. So I'm going to go ahead and start balling up some wires that I can use for twig pendants for the make along. So again, 18 gauge wire, 5.5 inches long, and the way that I hang on to my wire is I will place it in my cross-lock tweezers like this. So that gives me a good grip on this wire, and the wire does not flop around. So if I try to grab my wire like this wire is gonna, you know, kind of flip around and move around on me, and I don't want that while I'm working with a flame. So by using that angled tip there, you can get a nice firm grip on your wire, and it's going to stay steady. It's not going to flip around on you, not going to move around. And that's really important when you're working with flame, because we really want to concentrate the end of that wire right at the tip of that inner cone that we talked about earlier. So I'm going to go ahead and ignite my torch and lock that flame into place. So again, I'm going to grip that wire firmly, and I'm angling this so I can get in here in the front of the flame, and I'm just going to put that wire all the way in that flame, and this heats up the wire up the length of the wire, and notice how that end is already starting to ball. Now once it starts to ball, I'm going to go ahead and rotate it upward to get that ball centered, and then I'm going to heat soak that ball in this cool part of the flame, and that's going to smooth it out and sort of fire polish it. Now I can move this over to my quench, and I want to wait until the flame until the wire is gray. I don't want to quench while it's still red hot, and I'll show you why. So this wire we're going to go ahead and quench more quickly. So again, I'm going to hold it right at the tip of the flame, and that's going to heat up the whole shaft of the wire. Your ball's going to start to develop right there, and we can move that up and around. We'll heat soak it, and if I drop it quickly, notice that wire turned a bright red. Now some people like that. This is going to come off when you pickle it anyway, but this is a result of quenching too quickly. And I often see people, wondering why this happens. That's why. If you drop your wire in your quenching bowl while it's still red hot, you're going to get that discoloration there. Now, I don't know that it causes any harm necessarily, but I've just gotten in the habit of letting my wire cool a little bit in the air before I quench it, so that the wire is gray as it goes into the wire or into the water, and you don't get that discoloration. Now again, I don't know that it necessarily causes a problem. My sense is that it might weaken the wire just a little bit, but that's not something I've really experimented with, so I can't say for certain that that's true. Now, this is the fire scale that we were talking about. So notice that the wire is dark gray, and it just doesn't look coppery at all. But I'm just going to go ahead and ball the other ends of this wire before I pickled it. Let's do another one here. Again, I hold this straight into the flame, and that heats up the end of your wire. One of the problems that people have with butane torches and copper is that they feel that it doesn't heat the wire up enough. This is one way to get that done. And then I'm going to heat soak and polish my ball, let it cool just a bit, and quench it. Now I'm going to go ahead and ball up the other two ends of these two wires. So again, I've seen people hold their torches vertically with the flame pointing up. I'm not comfortable doing that. I like having my torch sitting squarely and firmly on my bench. I just feel safer that way. Again, I'm working in a very small, very confined environment, so I don't do anything that I consider risky. And to me, pointing your torch straight up in the air and pointing a wire down at it, that's a recipe for getting molten wire on your hand, and I'm just not interested in doing that myself personally. So I avoid it. We'll just let that cool a bit, drop it in the pickle. And I always cool the tips of my tweezers too if I've been using them continuously for a while. So here are 3 wires, and these are what I'll use to make a twig pendant. Now notice that the wires that I balled on both sides, they didn't come out the same length. This is something that takes practice, and it also takes getting to know your torch very well. So you've got to experiment with your torch. Prepare to go through some wire, set aside some scrap wire, and just experiment with your torch and figure out how much wire a typical ball will eat up. Now on my torch, it's usually between 1/4 and 1/2 inch, depending on how big I make the ball. I try to make my balls pretty consistent, so we can go ahead and measure these and see where we ended up. So remember, when I initially cut these wires, they were 5.5 inches long, and now the longer of my 2 wires with a ball on each end is 4 7/8 inches, and the shorter one is 4 3/4 of an inch. So each of those balls took up about 3/8 of an inch. So again, typically I see between 1/4 of an inch and 1/2 of an inch loss in length for each ball. So that's about typical for my torch. Now notice that the ball, this red one here, is a little bit smaller than the others. The other 3 balls are all pretty consistently sized, and that bright red one is just a little bit smaller. So that's the longer of my 2 wires. If I would have held that ball in there just a little bit longer, I would have ended up with a ball that was more consistent in size with the others, and that wire probably also would have ended up about 4 3/4 of an inch long. So again, this is something that takes practice and experience with your torch. Every torch is going to behave a little bit differently. Even though they're all using the same fuel, you're not always going to have the same flame adjustments, the flame air adjustments. So your flame, there's going to be some variance in the heat of that flame, and that's going to determine how much wire you use for each ball. So experiment, play around, use some scrap wire, get comfortable doing this process, and just practice making balls, practice trying to get them consistently sized, and see how much wire you use, and then keep that in mind as you're working on tutorials. We're going to do the Twig make along soon. As you're working on that tutorial, if you find that you use a little bit more wire than I use to make balls, go ahead and increase the cut length of your wires so you have a little bit extra wire to work with. And that's it. That's all there is to balling the ends of wire. Now I'm going to go ahead and drop these in my pickle pot and let them get cleaned up, and then I'll show you what they look like once they're all done. Okay, so the wires that I just balled have been soaking in my pickle for about 3 or 4 minutes. These should be about ready now. And notice that I'm using a bamboo skewer. See how clean and bright those are? Now I also have some bamboo tongs, and that's what I use to pull stuff out of my pickle. Now I always just take this out of my pickle and just drop it in my quenching bowl to rinse it. I want to get that copper sulfate off of there, so I use that quenching bowl to rinse off those wires. Now the reason that I use bamboo tools for this is because you don't want to introduce any steel into your pickle solution. Now this is mostly important if you are somebody who makes silver jewelry. Even if you do all silver but you use sterling silver. Sterling silver has some copper in it, and that's going to leach out in the pickle solution. So you're going to have copper sulfates in there even if you're not using copper wire. Now if you introduce steel to that environment, that's going to create basically an environment where you can end up with an electroplate of copper. So what will happen is if you put a steel tool in your pickle and then you pickle silver in there, it's going to end up plated with copper. And that's definitely not something that anybody wants to deal with, that basically ruins your copper or your silver. So always use wooden tools or plastic tools, or if you have some, if you can find them, you can use copper tweezers as well. But just avoid using steel tools. So I would never, for instance, introduce my crosslock tweezers into that solution, because I don't want to create that electroplating effect that happens if you put steel in your pickle. So in case you've ever heard somebody warn about putting steel in your pickle, that's why. And this also applies to if you use steel wool to clean your jewelry. You want to make sure you're not introducing any steel fibers into that pickle pot. So just be careful and keep that in mind. So now that our wires are balled, let's go ahead and look at some of these balls and talk about the results that we got. Now this is that smaller ball that was the bright red. That's the one I quenched really quickly. And you can see that color is mostly gone. You can see it's a little bit darker than the others. You can see just the slightest hint of that brighter color, but it's essentially gone. So the pickle does remove that color. So again, let's take a closer look at these balls. Notice that these are fairly shiny and smooth. There is a little bit of pitting. This one has some pits in it. Now this is typical of copper. You'll get a lot more of that if you don't heat soak the end of your ball in that cooler part of the flame. This one also has quite a bit of pitting, and this one's even a little bit misshapen on the end. It kind of has a flat spot. This is very, very typical of copper wire. I personally don't mind it. I think it looks fine. I think most of the jewelry that I make with balled ends, they're organic designs and they have a rustic feel to them anyway. And I think that just sort of adds to that rustic sense. But if you're very particular about getting nice smooth ends, there's a couple things you can do. One is just get very familiar with your torch and get very good at reading your wire and knowing when to remove it from the flame, when to fire polish, when to quench. That's going to help with the pitting. The other thing you can do is you can try moving up to a propane torch. Propane burns quite a bit hotter than butane, so a lot of people prefer using a propane torch for copper. I personally don't care for propane torches. I think they burn too hot. I find it a little bit difficult to control the size of the balls of my wire. I find that I end up losing a lot more wire because it balls up faster and you end up with larger balls. So I find a butane torch much easier to control. But if you are having a lot of difficulty getting consistently sized balls, first I'd say practice. Make sure you're familiar with your torch and that you really understand how to use it and you understand how it responds with copper wire and how much wire you're going to use. If you still find after practicing and sort of perfecting your technique, if you still find you're not getting the results you want, then go ahead and bump up to a propane torch. So that's it for today's tutorial. I hope you found this tutorial helpful. I know we spent a lot of time ramping up and talking about equipment and safety, and then we didn't spend all that much time on actually balling the ends of wire, and that's because it really is a pretty simple process. It's something you just need to try for yourself and experiment and practice. But you'll find, I think, pretty quickly with the few tips that I've given you that you can master this technique in no time. And before you know it, you're just going to be having a lot of fun using your torch. As always, if you have any questions, just drop them in the comments and I'll answer those just as soon as I can. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. That's it for today, wire weavers. Until next time, go make something beautiful.